All right, we're gonna record to the cloud. Okay. And we're not quite yet. Okay, are we live now? Okay, we are now live on YouTube. So Derek, you can go ahead and share that. We're gonna go to the speaker view. And Edith, you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. My name is Edith Tovar. I am the Senior Just Transition Community Organizer with the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. I am a lifelong resident of the Little Village community, and I am proud to call the Southwest Side my home. Today, we will be sharing with you, with Chicago residents and allies, a call to action after 2 reports show how the city failed to protect neighborhoods from industrial pollution. Our health is being sacrificed because some of the most dangerous industries that operate in Chicago are being allowed to cut corners. This practice of creating sacrifice zones in communities of color has to end. These are 2 reports that we are going to talk about today. Both are directly linked on how the city of Chicago continues to look the other way while our communities continue to be harmed and exposed to toxic chemicals and pollution coming from industries. We have a great list of speakers for our press conference this morning. And so I'm going to start us off with introducing Kim Wasserman, Executive Director of the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. Kim?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Okay. All right. So thank you very much for Neighbors for Environmental Justice and our sister organizations for being here with us today. And thank you, Alderman Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez, for joining us today as well. Since the Inspector General's report leaked last week, our organization has been processing the report and sharing the information we have in English with our community members. As you can imagine, those who have read it are still grappling with the revelations in it, and unfortunately reliving the devastating impacts following the negligent and inhumane permitting of Hilco's 2020 botched implosion. This report confirms what our communities have known to be true, that this administration and Hilco cannot be trusted. Mayor Lightfoot's administration continues to state that contractor negligence and failures led to the dust cloud that created fear and trauma in Little Village. Yet this report shows the contrary. Both the company and the administration staff played a direct and active role, driving the planned implosion forward and abandoning their duty to inform and protect the public. This is why today at 4 p.m., the Fuera Hilco Coalition, residents of the 22nd Ward and beyond, are presenting Alderman Rodriguez with a letter of demands based on the leaked Inspector General's report. As alderperson, he is responsible for representing our community's best interest at City Hall and being accountable to his ward in return. So we are demanding the following. We demand that Alderperson Rodriguez translate the IG report to Spanish language and publish it on his ward's website for residents to have access to it. Some Little Village residents have yet to read this document due to the lack of translation. We demand that Alderperson Rodriguez host an emergency meeting with city representatives, including Chicago Department of Public Health, Department of Buildings, and the Chicago Fire Department, with ample preparations made for questions and answers about what happened on April 11th, 2020, to review policy changes that have been made. This administration and our representatives have failed to take accountability for their negligent dereliction of responsibility, causing irreparable and permanent harm to the communities most vulnerable through the COVID-19 pandemic. We need to make sure that this and the next administration make full use of their powers granted by the municipal code and hold themselves accountable. We demand that Alderperson Rodriguez, working with CDPH, IEPA, and the community, do comprehensive soil sampling in the areas impacted by the botched implosion and share those results with the community. We demand that all work be paused on Hilco's 33rd and Lawndale site, and that the community be updated on what has happened on that site to date. We demand the community be given more than 10 days notice about the meeting and that the alderman use one of the 4 dates he's already holding to host the meeting in March. In addition, we demand that the City of Chicago prohibit any methods of implosion in the City of Chicago indefinitely, and that they apply the cumulative impact ordinance expectations across city departments and host interdepartmental hearings. Because we recognize that multiple reforms are needed, we also call on the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency to acknowledge its responsibility in facilitating the botched Hilco implosion and ensure that the agency expands its definition of environmental justice to allow for both more community participation and more oversight by EPA in environmental justice communities. The reality is our communities have been ringing the bell on Chicago and Illinois' structural racism that exacerbates environmental injustice. These reports and the HUD complaint are all proof of our lived experience. We call on the next administration to prioritize environmental justice and to do more to ensure that our city and state governments are actually protecting our communities and health and not facilitating sacrifice zones for industrial actors. Our communities cannot afford another botched implosion in Chicago. We cannot afford the continued co-opting of accountability and transparency by this administration. We just want to breathe. Thank you very much.
Kim, do you want to say some points in Spanish? Sorry, or do we want to come back?
Can we come back? Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kim. Up next, we have Anthony Moser, who is the board president of Neighbors for Environmental Justice.
Thank you, Edith. Good morning. We called this press conference today because of 2 reports that reached the same conclusion. The way the city enforces environmental laws is ineffective. The OIG described it as willful bureaucratic negligence. We call it ineffective by choice. What happened with Hilco is part of a pattern, and that pattern is what I want to talk about now. For this report, we examined 21 years of data provided by the Department of Administrative Hearings. That data includes every environmental violation prosecuted under the Department of Environment and under the Department of Public Health, listing the ordinances violated, the hearing dates, the outcomes, fines. And then we put it in context using city inspection reports, settlement contracts, and emails. I encourage everyone to read the whole thing because there's a lot there to unpack. But for right now, I'm just going to share the high-level findings and what we are recommending to address them. First, when the Department of Environment was dismantled, the total number of violations fell dramatically that were issued. In the 10 years from the beginning of 2002 to the end of 2011, there were twice as many citations as there were in the 11 years from the beginning of 2012 to the end of 2022. And it was even worse for air pollution. Citations for air pollution dropped by 90%. And when those citations were issued, they were mostly dropped. In the last 4 years, 40% of the air pollution citations that were issued went to 3 companies whose business model depends on polluting activities: General Iron, Sims Metal Recycling, and Pullman Innovations. All of those citations were dropped with no admission of liability. What I think is our most shocking finding is that the city intentionally stops issuing tickets for repeated violations. Just take a moment to think about how different that is from what ordinary people experience. If you leave your car parked in the wrong place, the city will ticket you over and over again until you get towed. If you get pulled over for speeding, just imagine saying, "Officer, you can't give me another ticket. I have 3 from last week that I haven't paid yet." But that is the reality for these large industrial facilities. 3 strikes and then you get warnings. And if you're wondering how the city decides who does and doesn't get this kind of grace, there are no guidelines. It's not a formal policy, just the Department of Public Health deciding who gets a pass and who doesn't. We even found cases where inspectors had issued tickets for what seemed like very clear violations. And the Department of Health chose not to follow through. We also found that after prolonged negotiations, sometimes stretching on for years, during which they are not issuing more tickets, the city regularly settles for inconsequential fines, dropping all charges in exchange. This practice was specifically also called out in the OIG report, which could not recommend further action against Hilco due to the legally preclusive effect of the city settling. So, you might be wondering what we'd like them to do instead. One of our other major findings is that the city has powers that it does not use. For example, the Commissioner of Public Health can issue abatement orders, effectively ordering businesses to halt specific activities or even overall operations until they are able to do so safely. This was also called out by the Inspector General, who noted that the Assistant Commissioner should have escalated these concerns to the Commissioner, who could have issued an emergency abatement order to prevent the demolition. That dust cloud is a strikingly clear example of what an emergency order can prevent. But the Commissioner can also issue non-emergency orders. They can add conditions to annual operating certificates. And that's why our first recommendation is for the city to use the powers that it already has. Attach conditions, issue abatement orders, fine companies for every day they break the law, which is also what is written in the municipal code. And if they keep violating the law, keep citing them for it. Capping the number of tickets is incoherent and unacceptable. We're also calling for the Department of Environment to be restored with a budget of at least twice what it had before, because the climate crisis has continued to intensify, and we have a lot of ground to make up for before we are even approaching a position of having functional environmental enforcement in this city. Furthermore, we need to pass a cumulative impacts ordinance, because if we can't effectively regulate the companies that are being permitted, then we need to stop permitting them, especially when they're being concentrated in areas that are already suffering from an excessive burden of air pollution and environmental harm. We also need to tie city contracts to environmental compliance. If people are doing business with the city, they should be held to the highest standards of environmental compliance. And yet there is no meaningful communication that happens between the Department of Public Health and the Department of Procurement Services to establish whether city vendors are in environmental compliance. This was actually established also during the recent budget hearings, when the heads of those departments were asked about this point blank. And the Department of Procurement Services said that Public Health was responsible for informing them. And the Commissioner of Public Health said that it was an interesting idea, but it's not something that they're doing. And finally, to get at all of this, we need to hold interdepartmental hearings. The City Council needs to have public hearings to demand accountability about what is happening and what has happened, so that we can understand how we got here and what we need to do to make it better. So those are the key findings of our report. And I want to underscore this, like, this is really just us validating what we've already known, right? The people who live next to these facilities have already known that environmental enforcement was ineffective. The people who experienced that dust cloud as a result of that demolition don't need to be told that the city has not been doing its job. But we have now documented this in a way that is quantifiable, and it is time, for the city to reckon with what has been documented, and it's time for this to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Up next, we have Rosana Rodriguez Sanchez, the 33rd Ward Alderwoman.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to speak English first, and then I'll translate in Spanish if that's okay. What has happened with the Hilco demolition and the lack of transparency around this disaster is so harmful to our communities. I am very grateful for this work, for this report. And there are many things that we can be doing from the municipal government in order to ensure that we repair the harm and ensure that this is never going to happen again in our communities. The first thing that needs to happen is that Lori Lightfoot's administration needs to release the report. The report is already out. We all know what it says. But because we haven't received the report by the proper channels, if we were to hold a hearing, we wouldn't be able to have really important witnesses to be able to testify in a hearing, such as the Inspector General. So we need to demand that the mayor of Chicago releases the report, and we need to be able to have access to that report, to have a full hearing on that report, to make sure that we understand what went wrong, and correct those mistakes, and place accountability, right? I think people need to take responsibility for the harm that has been done. We need to reopen the Department of the Environment, and that is such an important part of this issue, because we need a place in city government that is going to be able to create policy to ensure that we have the proper systems in place. And the reality is that what happened with Hilco happened not because it's an isolated incident, happens because we don't have those structures and those systems in place, right? Because we don't have a Department of the Environment, because every agency is doing whatever. And there is actually not a concerted effort to ensure that we are doing the work in an integrated way. But also, we need a cumulative impact ordinance, so that we can actually make sure that we are holding all of these businesses to a standard and not allowing them to come into neighborhoods that are already overburdened by pollution. So there's a lot of work to do. I am very committed to continuing to do this work from City Council, but we need more political will. We need to make sure that people are showing up, to make sure that we push for these changes. And this is urgent. We cannot wait. This cannot wait. Communities are doing the work. It is the responsibility of government to do the work. Buenos días, mi nombre es Rosana Rodríguez. Yo soy la concejal del Distrito 33. Estoy aquí en solidaridad con todos estos vecinos que han estado haciendo el trabajo para asegurarnos de que hay transparencia con el incidente de Hilco, de la demolición de Hilco, que terminó en un desastre de salud pública para comunidades en el suroeste de la ciudad. Yo creo que lo primero que tenemos que demandar es que la alcaldesa de Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, pueda hacer público el reporte sobre la demolición de Hilco, que fue desarrollado por la Oficina del Inspector General de la Ciudad de Chicago, aunque el reporte se ha hecho público ya. Es bien importante que se pueda hacer público de manera oficial, porque mientras no sea público de manera oficial, no podemos tener una audiencia en donde podamos tener testigos estrellas como lo es la Oficina del Inspector General, para que nos pueda decir qué fue lo que pasó, que podamos hacerle preguntas y que podamos establecer responsabilidad y asegurarnos de que no pase de nuevo. También es bien importante que se reabra la oficina del Departamento del Medio Ambiente en la ciudad de Chicago. Este fue un departamento que fue cerrado por el alcalde Rahm Emanuel, y no tenemos en Chicago una oficina que esté dedicada a crear políticas públicas para proteger el ambiente y para asegurarnos de que este tipo de cosas no pasen. Esto no es un incidente aislado. Lo que pasó con Hilco pasó porque no tenemos los sistemas adecuados para asegurarnos de que compañías mantengan unos estándares para poder proteger el medio ambiente. Mientras no tengamos sistemas que puedan hacer ese trabajo, vamos a estar siempre en riesgo de estar causándole daño a nuestras comunidades a nivel ambiental. También es importante que podamos tener una ordenanza de impacto acumulativo, porque ahora mismo no tenemos eso. Eso se puede hacer a través del Departamento del Medio Ambiente y sería bien importante que se pueda hacer, porque tenemos que asegurarnos de que estamos otorgando responsabilidad a las compañías que están viniendo a nuestras comunidades a contaminarlas. Y en la medida que no podamos regular esos negocios, siempre vamos a estar en riesgo de causarle daño a nuestras comunidades a nivel ambiental. Así que yo estoy aquí dispuesta y disponible para seguir trabajando y para seguir luchando del lado de nuestras comunidades. Las comunidades están haciendo el trabajo. Ahora es la responsabilidad del gobierno municipal, del gobierno de esta ciudad, de hacer el trabajo para proteger a nuestras comunidades, y es bien importante y urgente que podamos hacer ese trabajo juntos. Así que gracias por tenerme aquí hoy y estoy disponible para preguntas.
Muchísimas gracias por sus comentarios. Thank you very much for your comments. Up next, we have Cheryl Johnson, who is the Executive Director of People for Community Recovery.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cheryl Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of People for Community Recovery, a community-based organization founded in Allgale Gardens by my late mother, the Hazel Johnson, who is known as the mother of environmental justice. Our organization is almost 43 years old, and that's the premise of the things that we've been fighting: industrial pollution in our area. We know that these things happen. It's been happening for over 40-something years, and it's time for the city to take a grip and stop supporting industrial businesses in our community over our health. Because just like as people just mentioned today, we get ticketed as human beings, but these industries get a slap on the hand and get capped. Nothing should be capped in this community when it comes to public health. I think that, the investigation from HUD for 2 years, and they spoke to what we've been trying to say for many, many decades. Environmental racism exists in the city of Chicago. Now, just like I said, we've been doing this work since the 80s, and we're still seeing the practice of environmental racism based on us being Black and brown in our own communities, being impacted by industry. That's a shame. It was a shame when they closed in 2011, the year that my mother died, the environmental department. We don't only need an environmental center office department. We need an environmental justice department within the city of Chicago, where any permits is being issued need to be vetted through Department of Environmental Justice. Because these policies that's on books need to be enforced by the city of Chicago. And if they're not being supported, then there needs to be another process that we can go through as citizens of Chicago to get these enforcement happen. But why should we do it as citizens? This is the responsibility of the city of Chicago. And this is what we are all doing. We are policing our own community against the industry pollution that is affecting our health. That's a crime within itself. It's different than the violence that we see in our community with a bullet. It only can affect a very few, according to how many bullets in the shell. But look at what this industrial pollution do to thousands of people. Going about our daily life of work, school, and taking care of our business, but industry could come and poison our community without anything happening to them. It takes 2 years to get a report to show that it is violating our civil rights in the city of Chicago, and it must change. The city, we want to live in healthy communities just like anyone else. We've seen with General Iron, class and environmental racism moving the industry from a affluent neighborhood to a poor neighborhood like ours. Now you see the explosion that happened with the Hill Code. When is this going to be enough? When are you going to be here to protect your citizens in this city over the industries in this city. So our dream is simply to have clean air, live on land that's not contaminated, and drink safe water. That's a given right for all of us to be able to equally share and use. But we have people who's making these messed up mistakes and creating these policies or thinking they're above the law when it comes to regulating these industry in that area. If this stuff is already on the books, why the city ain't enforcing these things? Is it money and politics that governs what impact on our community? If that's the case, then we need to change all the leadership. Thank you. Bye.
Powerful words, Michelle. Thank you so much. Up next, we have Olga Bautista, the Executive Director of the Southeast Environmental Task Force.
Thank you so much. My name is Olga Bautista. I'm the Executive Director of the Southeast Environmental Task Force on the far southeast side of Chicago. We're dedicated to investigating, documenting, and exposing environmental and human rights abuses by polluters in the Calumet region, abuses that are sanctioned by every level of government and are rooted in the notion that Black and brown and poor whites don't matter. And in these final days of Black History Month, I would be remiss not to raise the demands of people of color demanding reparations for the pain and suffering our communities have endured through. Like Juliana Pino recently said from Little Village Environmental Justice Organization about the OIG report, the lawless procedural dehumanization of residents in EJ communities across the city of Chicago. Stopping General Iron was hard fought and hard won. It took nearly 4 years, and some Southeast Side activists, including a local teacher, went on a hunger strike that lasted a month to try to stop the massive car shredder and metals recycler from moving from the predominantly white and affluent Lincoln Park to the east side, the southeast side of Chicago, that is predominantly a working class people of color, a community of working class people of color. We did it without the support of our Alderwoman Susan Garza, who ran an environmental justice platform. And then the fight was so intense that it eventually led federal agencies to intervene and successfully urge the city to do the right thing and deny the facility a permit to operate in our community. And last fall, after nearly a 2-year-long investigation, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development sent a letter to Chicago officials demanding that the city change its illegal planning, zoning, and land use policies so they don't discriminate against people of color. HUD officials determined that the city continued a discriminatory pattern of relocating polluters from white communities to Black and Latino neighborhoods by helping General Iron in its attempt to move from Lincoln Park to the southeast side, even though they knew it would make us sick. To resolve the investigation, the city must address existing and potential environmental harms of General Iron's relocation plans while also adopting an enhanced fair housing planning process that includes plans to overcome disparities in environmental impacts. If the city of Chicago fails to change its policy, it could be cut from millions of federal dollars in federal funding. It's a relief to know that we're not alone in this fight. The work of Neighbors for Environmental Justice, Anthony Moser, is incredibly significant. It details the city of Chicago's pattern of settling cases with polluting companies or giving them a mere slap on the wrist instead of real accountability that will improve the quality of life of the residents living in ground zero for environmental racism. Today, I stand in solidarity with the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, demanding justice for La Villita and calling on the city of Chicago and Alderman Mike Rodriguez to take accountability for the neglect that led to the Hilco disaster. We cannot let this happen ever again. I stand in solidarity with people who have to worry day in and day out about all the possible ways their bodies have been hurt by toxic chemicals. The racism that has created sacrifice zones in Chicago must come to an end now. We cannot let another Hilco disaster happen again.
Thank you, Olga, and thank you for the reminder to end sacrifice zones. Up next, we have Wesley Eplin, who is the Policy Director at Health and Medicine Policy Research Group.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Wesley Eplin. I serve as Policy Director at Health and Medicine Policy Research Group. I'm also on the leadership team for the Collaborative for Health Equity Cook County. Urgent action is needed by Mayor Lori Lightfoot, the Chicago Department of Public Health Commissioner, Dr. Allison Arwady, and Chicago City Council to redress environmental racism in Chicago. So we are in solidarity with this community coalition. In 2021, Mayor Lori Lightfoot and CDPH declared that racism is a public health crisis in Chicago. Environmental racism is a big part of this crisis. CDPH recognized that environmental justice is critical for health equity in Healthy Chicago 2025, Chicago's Community Health Improvement Plan, stating, quote, communities disproportionately burdened by pollution will someday be able to breathe clean air free of harmful pollutants. CDPH also noted that structural racism is a cause of pollution-related health inequities on the west, southwest, south, and southeast sides of Chicago in the Chicago Air and Health Report of 2020. Regarding the Hilco Crawford smokestack demolition, CDPH allowed Hilco to expose countless Little Village residents, a predominantly Latinx community, to a plume of toxic dust, risking people's health, harming people's health. The city has not held its employees nor Hilco accountable. Further, the Ineffective by Choice report by Neighbors for Environmental Justice outlines how CDPH fails to use its full authority and all tools available to hold polluters accountable. This negligence worsens environmental racism given industrial site locations. As public health organizations, Health and Medicine Policy Research Group, and Cook County call on Mayor Lori Lightfoot, CDPH Commissioner Dr. Allison Arwady, the Chicago Department of Public Health itself, and Chicago City Council to act like racism is the public health crisis that it is and yield to the demands of this coalition. Furthermore, Chicago needs new policies designed to protect public health and advance environmental justice, such as the Cumulative Impact Ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. Aproximadamente vamos a invitar a la directora de El Vejo, Kim Wasserman, para que diga sus puntos en español. Kim?
Thanks, folks. My apologies. I wasn't ready earlier, so thank you. I will be brief. Primero, más que nada, gracias a los vecinos por justicia ambiental y las organizaciones que están aquí con nosotros hoy. Gracias a la concejal Rosana Rodríguez Sánchez por acompañarnos hoy también. Desde que se publicó el reporte del inspector general la semana pasada, nuestra organización ha estado procesando el informe y compartiendo la información que tenemos en inglés con los miembros de la comunidad. Como pueden imaginar, aquellos que lo han leído todavía están lidiando con las revelaciones que contiene y reviviendo las devastadoras impactos que siguieron a la negligente y inhumana concesión de permisos de la implosión de Hilco en 2020. Este reporte confirma lo que nuestras comunidades saben que es cierto, que no se puede confiar en esta administración y en Hilco. La administración del alcalde Lightfoot continúa afirmando que la negligencia y las fallas de los contratistas causaron la nube de polvo que creó miedo y trauma en la villita. Sin embargo, este reporte demuestra lo contrario. Tanto la empresa como el personal de la administración jugaron un papel directo y activo, impulsando la implosión planeada y abandonando su deber de informar y proteger a la comunidad. Por eso es que hoy a las 4 de la tarde, la coalición Fuera Hilco, residentes del Distrito 22, le van a presentar una carta de demandas al concejal Rodríguez basadas en el informe filtrado del inspector general. Como concejal, él es responsable de representar nuestros mejores intereses de nuestra comunidad en City Hall y a cambio rendir cuentas en nuestra comunidad. Exigimos, primero, que el concejal Rodríguez traduzca el informe de OIG al idioma inglés y que lo publique en su sitio de web para que los residentes comunitarios tengan acceso. Hasta hoy en día, algunos residentes de la villita no han podido leer el documento debido a la falta de traducción. Segundo, exigimos que el concejal Rodríguez organice una reunión de emergencia con representantes de la ciudad incluyendo el Departamento de Salud, el Departamento de Edificios y el Departamento de Bomberos de Chicago, con amplio preparativos para preguntas y respuestas sobre lo que sucedió el 11 de abril y para revisar los cambios que se han hecho de leyes. Esta administración y nuestros representantes no han asumido la responsabilidad por su abandono negligente de la responsabilidad que causó daños irreparables y permanentes a la comunidad más vulnerable durante la pandemia de COVID-19. Necesitamos asegurarnos de que esta y la próxima administración hagan todo lo que puedan y usen todo el código municipal y que se hagan responsables. Exigimos que el concejal Rodríguez, en colaboración con el Departamento de Salud Pública, la Agencia de Protección Ambiental del Estado y la comunidad, realice muestras de la tierra en las áreas afectadas por la implosión y comparten los resultados con la comunidad. Exigimos que se detenga todo el trabajo en el sitio de la 33 y la Landale del Hilco y que se actualice informes a la comunidad sobre qué ha pasado en ese sitio hasta esta fecha. Finalmente, exigimos que se notifique a la comunidad con más de 10 días de anticipación sobre la reunión y que escoge una de las 4 fechas que ya tiene para organizar la reunión en marzo. Además, exigimos que la ciudad de Chicago prohíbe cualquier método de implosión en la ciudad de Chicago indefinitivamente y que aplique las perspectivas de la ordenancia de impacto acumulativo en todos los departamentos de la ciudad y haga audiencias interdepartamentales. Debido a que reconocemos que se necesitan múltiples reformas, hacemos un llamado a la Agencia de Protección Ambiental del Estado, EPA, para que también reconozca su responsabilidad en facilitar la implosión fallada de Hilco y se asegure de que la agencia amplíe su definición de justicia ambiental para permitir una mayor participación de la comunidad y una mayor supervisión por parte de EPA en comunidades de la justicia ambiental. La realidad es que nuestras comunidades han estado haciendo sonar la campana sobre el racismo estructural en Chicago y en Illinois, que exacerbe la injusticia ambiental. Estos informes y la queja de HUD son prueba de que nuestras experiencias vividas son reales. Hacemos un llamado a la próxima administración para que priorice justicia ambiental y haga más para garantizar que nuestros gobiernos municipales y estatales realmente protejan a nuestras comunidades y nuestra salud y no continúen facilitando zonas de sacrificio para los actores industriales. Nuestras comunidades no pueden permitir otra implosión fallada en Chicago. No podemos permitir la cooptación continua de la responsabilidad y transparencia por parte de esta administración. Solo queremos respirar. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Kim. Thank you, Kim, and thank you to all of our speakers. We will give media an opportunity, and now is a good time if folks have any questions. If you want, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Maxwell Evans with Block Club Chicago. I had a question for Alderwoman Rodriguez. To your understanding, what is the status of a cumulative impact ordinance in City Hall right now? I understand the Lightfoot administration was supposed to introduce one to council in 2021, and community groups are still drafting language as well. Just wanted to see if you had any other input about the status of that ordinance.
We don't really have an update right now about it. I feel like nothing is really moving inside of City Council at this point. But I am happy to do some more research to see where it is at. We haven't gotten an update in a while.
And in case any of the community groups on this call were involved in helping to draft that, I would like to hear from you all as well if you have updates.
I can go if folks like. So what I can say is that different groups that make up the Chicago Environmental Justice Network have been participating with the city in the creation of the cumulative impact ordinance. And I think the reason why we're continuing to push on that is because we want to make sure that the process that we're currently in with this administration actually produces policy and not just another report to sit on the shelf. And so we're in this process now. Not sure of how this is going to move forward. And so our work is to really push on our electeds to ensure that this process, again, just doesn't produce a paper that sits on the wall, but is actually able to be executed along with all the municipal codes that Neighbors has highlighted to ensure that environmental communities are protected. And I think that's our biggest concern, is that this process not just be another law that the city doesn't exercise, but try to figure out how this plus the current laws on the book can actually be flexed, and that the city departments aren't afraid, for whatever reason, to make them happen and put them into action.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Karina. I'm reporting for the Chicago Tribune. My question is for Anthony, but anyone else feel free to jump in if you have something to say. So Anthony, in your report, you talked about the David Graham rule, and David Graham was cited in the Inspector General's Hillco investigation. Can you speak a little bit to if and how the David Graham rule was applied to Hillco specifically?
Yeah. So what I called that in the report is because he's the one who explicitly defined this, right? That this is actually a city practice that has been in place, I think longer actually than he's been the assistant commissioner, but he is the one who articulated it. And also I found in city inspection reports that it's something that was happening a lot more in recent years. What I mean by that, right, is the practice that he outlined of not issuing additional tickets for ongoing violations. So that's something that I saw first. It kind of kicked off this whole enforcement report. It's something that I saw first from Matt Asphalt, where there would be tickets issued, there were a few tickets issued, and then there were a long string of inspections that seemed to document the same kind of violations happening. But instead of ending with a ticket, they would just say enforcement action is pending, or CDPH will continue to observe and investigate, rather than continuing to issue tickets for new violations, right? And as far as how that applies to Hillco, I don't know that that's really on display with the demolition specifically, because that was, a singular event where there was kind of a series of administrative and bureaucratic failures that allowed it to happen. But it's not really like they're not out there doing that every week, right? That more is about describing how they handle companies like Pullman Innovations on the Southeast side, or that was on display for General Iron, where they had a number of tickets that were issued, and then an ongoing series of inspections that would document the same kind of conditions, but no tickets. And instead they would say enforcement is pending.
Thank you so much.
I had another question if no other reporters had.
Go ahead.
This is for my colleague, Alderman Michael Rodriguez had said he would like to pass an ordinance in city council this year to change city law, shifting the ability to release inspector general reports from the mayor to the inspector general themselves. Do El Vejo and Neighbors for Environmental Justice support an ordinance like that?
I can't say that we've discussed it in a real detail, but we continue to support transparency and the release of these OIG reports. And I certainly think that the way that this one has been withheld has been inappropriate. And I think that the claims that were made about whether or not it was able to be released, I think are kind of spurious. And so, yeah, I think anything that we can do to kind of formalize the expectation that these reports should be made public is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I would agree with Anthony. We haven't had a chance to discuss it, quite honestly, because our alderman hasn't stepped up to be accountable for his inaction to begin with on the whole demolition. And so I think before we talk about what other solutions are needed, first and foremost, our alderman needs to step into his positionality as alderperson and show face to the community and answer for his actions or inactions before we can start to talk about what are necessary actions to move forward around things like IG reports.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? ¿Tienen preguntas? If there are no more questions, si no hay preguntas, thank you very much for attending our press conference this morning. Muchísimas gracias por asistir a nuestra prensa de conferencia. I do want to highlight and remind folks that we will be doing a letter delivery to Alderman Mike Rodriguez's office today at 4 p.m. For those who would want to join us, you are more than welcome to meet us at his office. And thank you so much again for being here, and much appreciation to and for EJ and all the organizations and individuals that have participated and attended today's conference. Thank you.